Because sensory receptors are always on or associated with neurons, we can describe one neuron and all of its receptors as a sensory unit. This is an analogous term to motor unit, which we talked about in the skeletal muscle unit. Remember, we defined that as a motor neuron and all of the muscle fibers that it can control. Now, sensory units, just like motor units, can be really big with a lot of receptors or really small with fewer receptors. Each sensory unit has a receptor field, which is the area or region that it can receive sensory input from. This is easiest to think about by imagining touch receptors, which are located on the skin. The branch dendrites of a sensory neuron will contain mechanoreceptors that will essentially cover an area of the skin. And so this sensory neuron's receptor field is essentially that area. It's the area of the skin covered by the dendrites. Now, because we have many sensory neurons, we can have many receptor fields. And in many cases, there's overlap between receptor fields. So this is what's happening on this picture on the left-hand side here, where there's overlap between the receptor field of the first sensory unit on the left side and the second sensory unit on the right-hand side. If you remember the patterns that we've established in the neurophysiology unit and in the skeletal muscle unit, remember that graded potential always develops on the dendrites. That leads to an action potential in the axon, which leads to neurotransmitter release from the axon terminal. The process of sensation follows this exact same pattern, so we're not really breaking any rules. The sensory receptors are located on the dendrites, and they produce a graded potential that's called receptor potential. Receptor potentials are essentially EPSPs, excitatory postsynaptic potentials. Now remember that the defining characteristic of graded potential is that it has variable amplitude. And that means that receptor potentials can also have variable amplitude. This is really important because we receive varying amounts of stimulus intensity all the time. And receptor potentials are always going to be in proportion to the stimulus intensity. So the image on this slide is showing us how as we increase the intensity of a stimulus moving from left to right, we get a corresponding increase in membrane potential on the dendrites. So we could say, for example, that a light touch is a low intensity stimulus that's going to produce a small EPSP in the sensory neuron. But if I push really hard on the surface of my skin, that's going to be a much greater stimulus intensity. And so my neurons would produce a much greater receptor potential, a much greater EPSP. But the graded potential on the dendrites creates a functional problem because we know that graded potentials decrease in intensity over time and over distance. And if we're talking about, say, a touch receptor on the tip of my finger here, that message has to travel almost a meter to get into the spinal cord. And it would never make it if it was only a graded potential because it's a passive electrical signal. So following the same pattern as before, the receptor potential that develops in the dendrites travels to the axon hillock, and that initiates the action potential. And it's the action potential that's going to travel that great distance all along the axon to bring the message into the central nervous system, again, into the spinal cord. But in solving this problem of distance, we actually create another problem. So even though the action potential can travel over a great distance, remember that it has a constant amplitude throughout that entire process. So that means we can't use the amplitude of the action potential to encode the intensity of the stimulus. In other words, if I have a weak touch or a strong touch, I'm still going to be producing an action potential that reaches a peak of about positive 30 millivolts. Because remember, the action potential is always the same. Now, when my dog was a puppy, he went to puppy kindergarten. And one of the things that the dog trainer emphasized was that dogs value quantity over quality. So in other words, if you want to reinforce a positive behavior in your dog, it's better to break the biscuit up into a bunch of small pieces and then feed it to them bit by bit, rather than give them one big, delicious, biscuity treat. So our brains actually function in a very similar way. they care a lot about quantity. So the intensity of a stimulus is due to the frequency of action potentials. A stronger stimulus creates more receptor potential, more EPSPs, but that ultimately results in more frequent action potentials, whereas a weaker stimulus creates less receptor potential, lower amplitude EPSPs that give us less frequent action potentials. This works because that will also allow us to change the amount of neurotransmitter that gets released into the synapses in the central nervous system. So that's one way to think about that. And another similarity with skeletal muscle is that a really strong stimulus can also lead to the recruitment of multiple sensory units. So really frequent action potentials from multiple sensory neurons would result in a really strong stimulus being sensed by the brain.